Hi, everyone. Welcome to Liberty Speaks podcast. I'm Dr. Irene Mavrikakis, and Liberty Speaks podcast is the outreach arm of Liberty Speaks Inc., which is a nonprofit 501c4 that seeks to promote the vital concept that everyone has a right to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. I'm super excited to have our next guest. Her name is Joomi Kim. She's a PhD biologist. Welcome, Joomi.
Hi, thanks for having me.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on. There's so much that I'd like to talk to you about. But the impetus for me reaching out to you to come on Liberty Speaks was a recent video that you did about media lies. And I just, for the sake of the audience, we're going to run some clips about it. But I do want to ask a little bit of your political history and how we got to this point in time. This video is something that I think everybody in the United States and around the world needs to watch. And for me personally, it's the video in my head that I should have done that Joomi did. It's so important and, of course, done way better than I could have ever done it. And I really want, on behalf of myself and the world, to thank you that you did the due diligence to spend the time to do what we all should be doing, which is to find truth in facts that are verifiable, because I think the path to the reestablishment of this constitutional republic lies in fact finding and truth. So, Joomi, maybe you want to tell us, how did you get to this point? And then we could run through some of the clips that we talked about.
Yeah, sure. So I was always a lifelong Democrat. I even volunteered for Obama when he first ran. I was like knocking on doors in Virginia. And when Trump was elected in 2016, I was devastated. I thought he was just awful. And but over COVID, we'll talk more about that later, but over COVID, I did notice all these lies that the media was telling. So I grew to distrust them more and more. And then at some point, I noticed that they were also telling blatant lies about Trump. The first moment for me was about the speech that he gave in Charlottesville, when everyone was saying, that he said we had very fine people on both sides, and they were claiming that, that included white nationalists, neo-Nazis. But when you actually watch the full clip, it's clear that he's not including those people there. That it's clear, and I just had never heard the full clip. I just relied on the media as like a filter, that told me how to think about this person. And I had never really heard him directly, before. I hadn't listened to his speeches or interviews or anything. So that was a moment for me when I felt like, okay, I have to just re-examine everything that I've been told about Trump, because if they can lie so blatantly, what else have they lied about? Plus, I had already seen how we'd seen so many media lies about the COVID vaccines by that point. So, I looked into that, and it turned out there were many other lies. And, there are so many other things too, which I discussed in the video, that eventually made me realize that the Democratic candidate was not the way to go. She was the antithesis of so many of my core values. And then so I made this video because I felt like I knew what it's like to be that person on the political left, a Democrat. And a lot of people around me are still in this sort of bubble where they are Democrats. And I was dreading having to explain to them what my vote was going to be. And there was no way that I can just explain it really quickly in just like a minute or two. There's just no way, right? Because there's so many things that they haven't seen. We've been living in totally different worlds. So that's why I wanted to put this video together, so that I can just kind of explain it all at once,
And it's just a beautiful thing, I think, that your inclination to do this video was for yourself and your loved ones. And I'm wondering, was there a point when you were in the middle of this that you realized, this actually is really important for many to see? Did you have that kind of realization that this was beyond what your initial intention was? And how did that feel when you realized, what, this is worse than I thought, or something like that?
Yeah, no, it wasn't just for like my friends. I wanted to share it, and to have other people, to help other people share it with their family and their friends.
Okay. Yeah.
And because we can't go on the way we have been, where the two halves of the country are just living in completely different worlds. It's just like a recipe for civil war. Half the country thinks the other half is like racist, bigoted, and deplorable or garbage, basically, right? And I was also just thinking about after the election, because even if Trump wins, it's very hard to keep a country together and to govern a country that's so divided, and where they're just living in totally different worlds. We have to try to converge somehow. So I was hoping, yes, that people could try to use it to share with their Democrat or lefty friends.
Right. I think it's very well done. And to your point, really, the establishment on both sides, if we're being honest, the Republicans and the Democrats, are really both incredibly guilty of divide and conquer and splitting us over the big top 5 divisive issues, when the overwhelming majority of Americans just want food, water, clothing, shelter, and purpose. Purpose is a big part of it. And a lot of what's happened to this country has removed purpose as we push towards a lot of socialist ideology. And, when we talk to some people who have grown up in countries like that, the biggest part to destroy the human soul is to take away humans' creativity and purpose and the innate reward system of that concept. So I really think it's incredibly well done. So the first clip that I'd like to go to, it talks about vaccine safety and ads by pharma. And let's look at the clip first, and then I'd like to talk about how we got to this point and why this is one of the most important points as it relates to the capture of our healthcare system and serious issues with safety and efficacy of modern medicine. So let's see if Chris can get this clip up.
RFK Jr. No, he did not eat a dog. And they want everyone to think that he's a crazy anti-vaxxer. His views on vaccines are much more nuanced than that, and they're ones that a lot of Americans would agree with.
And I've never been anti-vaccine. I'm called anti-vaccine because that's a way of kind of marginalizing and discrediting me. But what I've said is I'm pro-science and pro-safety, and we ought to subject vaccines, which are mandated for healthy children, not for sick people. We ought to subject them to at least the kind of rigorous placebo-controlled trials that are mandated for every other medicine. It's the only medicine that's exempt from pre-licensing safety trial.
I believe we should have safe vaccines, and I believe we should have robust science, and I believe that we should have independent regulators who are not financially tied to the companies that make our vaccines. There's a couple of problems with vaccines. I had 3 vaccines as a kid. Today's kids get 72. And the reason they get so many is because they're so profitable. And they were made profitable in 1986 when Congress passed a law that said you can't sue a vaccine company. So no matter how toxic the ingredient, no matter how negligent the company, no matter how grievous your injury, you can't sue them, which means that company has no incentive to make them safer. And remember, the 4 companies that make all 72 of the vaccines that are now mandated for our kids are all serial felons.
He has been especially critical of COVID vaccines, but his viewpoints are backed by numerous scientific studies and statements from highly qualified scientists and doctors. I will link to a comprehensive article about that below. Part of the reason you haven't heard more about these studies or highly qualified scientists and doctors is that big pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer have so much money that they can advertise on all the corporate media outlets, so they can prevent certain stories from ever going out.
Is brought to you by Pfizer.
CBS Health Watch sponsored by Pfizer.
Anderson Cooper 360. Brought to you by Pfizer.
ABC News Nightline. Brought to you by Pfizer.
CNN Tonight. Brought to you by Pfizer.
This Week with George Stephanopoulos is brought to you by Pfizer.
And now a CBS Sports Update brought to you by Pfizer.
Meet the Press Data Download. Brought to you by Pfizer.
This portion of CBS This Morning sponsored by Pfizer.
And by the way, the media has suggested that Kennedy is some kind of grifter who went into anti-vaccine advocacy for the money. But if anything, speaking out against vaccines is obviously a risk for anybody's reputation and earning potential. Until RFK Jr. became a so-called anti-vaxxer, he was well regarded as an environmental lawyer. As a Kennedy, he could have coasted on his name and lived out his days comfortably. It's much more likely that he would have earned more money by never saying anything about vaccines. I encourage you to actually listen to what he has to say in his own words. For example, here's a 45-minute speech he gave when he suspended his presidential campaign and announced.
So, Joomi, there's just a couple of things that I'd like to say, and then I'd like to get your feedback. One point that I think Americans in the world need to understand is in 1986, a law was passed that Kennedy discussed, HR 5546, that established the Vaccine Adverse Event Reporting System and the Healthcare Compensation Fund, for which before COVID, over $7 billion has been paid out for the vaccine injuries that you don't know about. And according to its own internal documents, the Lazarus report, only 1 to 10% of vaccine injuries are even reported because people don't know about the system. And so since then, vaccines on the schedule have quadrupled, and there has been no safety studies in the last 30 to 40 years on the current vaccine schedule, according to Freedom of Information Act that was requested by ICANN. And the point that people need to understand, and Aaron Siri from Children's Health Defense and the Siri law firm does an amazing testimony in the Arizona State House about this, is that in the United States of America and in general across the world, fear of getting sued drives safety. It is the only product in the world that has product liability protection, and it's being injected into humans. And since then, it's a matter of fact that the vaccine schedule has quadrupled since then. And people need to understand that the reason why vaccine makers have so much money to be the major advertisers in the mainstream media and the US Open, where one tennis player refused to get the vaccine, is because they are making all this money on the vaccines that they can't be sued for. And it is most people's belief that if this didn't exist, the COVID vaccine and biologics would have never been launched upon the general population because of two major things. The preclinical trials had already shown serious safety and efficacy issues. And it's a matter of fact that respiratory virus vaccinations cannot prevent transmission or getting the disease. We already knew that before we entered into this situation. And so this law is a crux of the issue. And the PrEP Act is the act that's similar to this, that does for experimental vaccines and biologics, and established the COVID countermeasure injury program, which you have to report your injury within a year. And so I just think that it's just incredibly important for people to understand what's really going on here. Joomi, I know that you know all of this, and I just know that you've researched this as well, and I would love to have your thoughts on these concepts.
Yeah, so it's interesting because right now I'm seeing this campaign on social media and in media where they're, attacking RFK Jr. because he's saying he's going to play a role in the Trump administration. They're saying, wow, that's scary because he's an anti-vaxxer and all these things. They're saying the same things over and over. But he's saying a lot of things that make a lot of sense, which I think if you just asked most Americans, like, do you think this is sensible? Like, to remove this liability immunity, I mean, is there anyone who's really against that? I mean, aside from the pharmaceutical industry, and so many people are just unaware of that, actually, that's a thing, that you can't sue the companies. And yes, the government has like this tiny compensation program for people who get injured, but it's a tiny percentage of people get the money, and then what they do get is paltry. It's tiny compared to some of the injuries, right? So a lot of people are just unaware of these things, and they've just been propagandized that vaccines are good. They save lives, and if you criticize them, you are anti-science. The propaganda is just so strong, but that we have lost some common sense, yeah.
No, exactly. And the reason why the 1986 law was passed, removing product liability, was because for the few vaccines that were on the market, they were getting lawsuits and losing for harm that was occurring. And so instead of pushing vaccine companies to make more safe and efficacious products, they removed product liability. And that is an incredibly dangerous situation that has led to the debacle that led to setting the stage to what I call COVID mania tyranny, and the lack of separation of science and state, and the lack of true scientific discourse. So I think that this point is incredibly important. And I think that you're right. Most people don't know this, because I still tell people and they don't believe me. And I literally have to show them video clips. And there can't be a video clip of me on a podcast because they were like, well, someone else needs to say it. Okay, well, let me show you the law and the actual HR 5546. So
Well,
yeah.
sorry. There are mainstream articles that spell
Mhm.
this out, that you can't sue the vaccine companies. You know, they actually have said it. I mean, during COVID, they were not emphasizing that. But I'm saying these articles exist, you know, from like NBC or CBS. I forget which networks, but yeah.
Yes, yes. And there's some old news clips, we don't have them, where they talk about, a vaccine that caused significant harm, which was only to 50 people, that was recalled 20 or 30 years ago. The idea that modern medicine should first do no harm. And the other idea that is really important during COVID mania tyranny is that we had failure to provide informed consent, because informed consent necessitates full disclosure of all the risks and the free ability to decline. And that free ability to decline cannot be tied to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness, because our Constitution gives us these rights, and we're supposed to be protected by the government for these rights. And during COVID, the government became the destroyer of life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. So you're absolutely right. And it is on mainstream. And still, sometimes I'll show people and they still don't believe me, but we're working on it, right? Because this video is very important. Did you want to talk about that? Or I have the next clip, which is also incredibly important. It's about free speech, the Great Barrington Declaration. Chris, can you bring that up, please?
Of free speech. This is a central issue for some of the former Democrats who have moved to Trump. That's because the Biden administration has been using big tech to censor U.S. citizens. Mark Zuckerberg, co-founder and CEO of Meta, formerly known as Facebook, has said that the Biden administration pressured Facebook to censor Americans. This is a letter from Zuckerberg that attests to this. It was written as part of an investigation into potential government censorship of Americans, led by the House Judiciary Committee. In the letter, Zuckerberg wrote, "In 2021, senior officials from the Biden administration, including the White House, repeatedly pressured our teams for months to censor certain COVID-19 content, including humor and satire, and expressed a lot of frustration with our teams when we didn't agree." So, to be clear, this was not just some private company deciding to censor U.S. citizens. This was the U.S. government pressuring a private company to censor U.S. citizens for them. Of course, the government isn't allowed to censor citizens, but they got the social media companies to do the dirty work for them. The Biden administration also got Twitter to censor. They censored academics like Jay Bhattacharya, an epidemiologist and professor of medicine at Stanford University. During the COVID pandemic, he and Martin Kulldorff, who at the time was professor of medicine at Harvard Medical School, and Sunetra Gupta, epidemiologist at University of Oxford, got together and co-authored a document called the Great Barrington Declaration. This was a document that expressed grave concerns with government COVID policies. It recommended focused protection of those who were most vulnerable to COVID-19, instead of indiscriminately locking everyone down. Here's what they said. "We know that vulnerability to death from COVID-19 is more than 1,000-fold higher in the old and infirm than the young. Indeed, for children, COVID-19 is less dangerous than many other harms, including influenza. The most compassionate approach that balances the risks and benefits of reaching herd immunity is to allow those who are at minimal risk of death to live their lives normally, to build up immunity to the virus through natural infection, while better protecting those who are at highest risk. We call this focused protection." The declaration got over 940,000 signatures. Over 16,000 were from medical and public health scientists, and over 47,000 were from medical practitioners. But if you never heard about this document or only saw negative headlines about it, it was because there was a campaign to undermine it. In fact, Anthony Fauci and Francis Collins, the head of the NIH, were part of the campaign to discredit the Great Barrington Declaration. We know this because emails between the two of them were released due to a Freedom of Information Act request. Here's an email where the head of the NIH, Francis Collins, tells Anthony Fauci that they need to take down the Great Barrington Declaration. He links to the Great Barrington Declaration here. Then he says, "This proposal from the 3 fringe epidemiologists who met with the secretary seems to be getting a lot of attention, and even a co-signature from Nobel Prize winner Mike Levitt at Stanford. There needs to be a quick and devastating published takedown of its premises. I don't see anything like that online yet. Is it underway?" Later that day, Fauci responded with an email that linked to this article to indicate to Francis Collins that indeed, a quick and devastating published takedown was underway. There were several things that were remarkable about what these emails revealed. It showed that our health officials were not interested in outside opinions from other experts. But also, it's remarkable that they were calling the founders of the Great Barrington Declaration fringe epidemiologists, when they were from institutions like Stanford, Harvard, and Oxford universities. When Dr. Jay Bhattacharya learned of these emails, he tweeted this: "So now I know what it feels like to be the subject of a propaganda attack by my own government. Discussion and engagement would have been a better path." Jay Bhattacharya and others had also been actively censored on social media.
The crux is that the Biden administration essentially set up its government so that it would go to social media companies, tell the social media companies, you must censor these people and these ideas, where they would list out the ideas, ideas like the evidence on masking is not so good, that there is immunity after COVID recovery, that the vaccines don't stop you from getting and spreading COVID. They would go to the social media companies and say, you need to censor people that say these things on social media posts. You need to develop algorithms that automatically identify posts that have those ideas in them. You need to suppress the reach of them, and you need to suppress a list of people. It turns out that I'd been placed on this blacklist the day I joined Twitter in 2021.
What did it feel like when you are reading, something and then you are on a blacklist in the United States of America, your adoptive country?
It was surreal, Nick. I grew up, as you said, in the United States, and I went to school in the United States from when I was 4. The American civic religion is free speech. Of course, that could never happen in modern America. And then to see my name on a blacklist I didn't know how to process it.
The government says we were not insisting on this. Is that just, in your mind, that's just BS?
I mean, there's a line, but the government crossed the line. In the discovery of the case, what you find is it's a range of things. There's things like that, which is like, we're not sure.
Yeah.
But ranging to, kick these people off or else. The or else was very often Section 230. Section 230 is a part of the Communications Decency Act.
Right.
And it enables social media companies to exist.
Right.
It's
the Internet's First Amendment.
Exactly, right? So like you can publish something, I can publish something on Twitter, and then Twitter can't get sued if I lie about somebody else. So the implication would be, if you don't cooperate with us, we're going to go after you using legislative and regulatory mechanisms to take away some of those protections. In the House did its own investigation of the Facebook files, and what they found was that Facebook will have these internal discussions where they say, well, if we don't cooperate, we're not going to be able to get some of these legislative priorities that we really need to survive as a company. The response from the social media companies reads like a hostage situation. Like they're trying their best to try to negotiate with people that have held themselves while being held hostage, to the power that the government has over them.
If epidemiologists like Jay Bhattacharya and others hadn't been censored, we might have lifted lockdowns much sooner. This probably would have been much better for society because, in retrospect, it looks increasingly clear that lockdowns cause irreparable harms. During lockdowns, people with addictions weren't able to go to support group meetings, although liquor stores were allowed to remain open. Isolated people or people with mental health issues could not engage in person with their communities, churches, or therapists. We also saw an increase in depression and anxiety. Cancers and other health issues were not caught early as people delayed screenings. People were blocked from visiting their dying loved ones in hospitals. It was also the largest wealth transfer in history to the super rich. Small businesses had to shut down, but Walmart was allowed to stay open. We also had supply chain issues, record money printing, and accelerated inflation. School closures meant a lot of children got behind in education, especially those from poor backgrounds. We had an increase in deaths of despair, like suicide, or deaths from alcohol or drug overdoses. We have many studies that strongly suggest that lockdowns didn't affect the rate of COVID-19 mortality anyway. In the end, lockdowns may have caused more deaths than they saved. I encourage you to check out this comprehensive review on the impact of lockdowns. The article said, this cumulative academic research shows that the collateral damage of the pandemic response was substantial, wide-ranging, and will leave behind a legacy of harm for hundreds of millions of people in the years ahead. Many original predictions are broadly supported by the research data, including a rise in non-COVID excess mortality, mental health deterioration, child abuse and domestic violence, widening global inequality, food insecurity, lost educational opportunities, unhealthy lifestyle behaviors, social polarization, soaring debt, democratic backsliding, and declining human rights. According to the same House Judiciary Committee investigation mentioned earlier, the Biden administration also pressured social media companies to censor content about the origins of.
So there's so much important information there. Joomi, did you discover a lot of this over the last 4 years? I'd like to talk about details, but the human experience for you as someone learning all of this, what was that like? Would you like to share some of that?
Sure, yeah. So I did not really question too much about like I thought the lockdowns were very extreme, but I had no idea about censorship or any of these other things for a while. And once the COVID vaccines came out, I actually took 2 shots of Moderna. So I might have felt like a little bit unsure because it was new technology, but I thought, well, it's mRNA, and mRNA doesn't last that long. It turns out that's not true in this case, but that's what I thought. At the very least, that mRNA, I thought it wouldn't be something that would last long in the body, right? So I took the shots, which I now regret. And I guess a few months after that, I'm not exactly sure when, but at some point after I'd taken the shots, I saw on social media that some people were saying that it wasn't safe, and that one of the first things I was looking at was spike protein, and there were some claims that spike protein was cytotoxic. So I just looked into it myself. I read some papers, and I realized that what the media was saying was very different from studies that you can find. The media or Reuters fact check articles would say there's no evidence that the spike protein is cytotoxic, and that was just false. There were plenty of studies by then. Since then we've had even more, but even by then we'd had several, at least a handful. So I just felt like even if you felt like if you're a media outlet covering this, the honest way would be to say that, okay, there is some evidence, but you could still argue like, oh, but it's still safe. But yeah, there's some evidence, concerning things, And so once I saw that was pretty alarming to me, actually, to see that gap between what's in studies and what was in the media. And then I just kept looking from there. I just kept reading more papers. And honestly, social media was so important here because even though at that time, YouTube and Twitter were censoring a lot of this information, you could still get some of it, this information that you wouldn't see in like corporate media. So I would look into some of those claims that I'd see on social media, and not all of them were correct, but there was more truth to it than what the corporate media was claiming.
Yeah, well, first of all, I'm sorry that your healthcare provider did not provide proper informed consent as it relates to a medical procedure that you received. That needs to be reiterated.
Most doctors are clueless on this. They're totally clueless.
Right, but I give them no excuse because standard of care in medicine is that you provide informed consent. And a little background for me, we spoke about this offline, is in 2012, I was vaccine injured by the flu shot. I was sick for 8 years, incredibly sick, actually. And I have fought my way back to health and wellness through a long journey. And during that time, I did many deep dives into vaccine safeties and efficacy. And so when this all started, I had already seen the patent for the mRNA biologics and had already started to warn people about a vaccine that they were going to mandate in the spring of 2020, and already trying to tell people that hydroxychloroquine and zinc was safe and effective, and that we needed to promote nutraceuticals, that vitamin D levels above 50 nanograms per milliliter would really decrease illness. And there's some other studies like flu vaccine increases coronavirus susceptibility by 36%, which is probably why we had an increase in positive PCR testing to COVID in healthcare workers, military, nursing homes. And there's some other studies that show that flu vaccine and probably COVID causes an IgE or allergy autoimmunity, and that's a component of the cytokine storm. And all of that information that I'm telling you, and the serious issues with safety and efficacy, and the fact that respiratory virus vaccinations and biologics can never prevent transmission, are all known scientific facts that existed at the time that you went to your healthcare provider and had this injection. And I have spoken to many lawyers, and they are going to pursue this avenue. There's some also good recent court cases on, the inability for businesses to mandate and things like that, and employment. And there's been a lot of recent wins, including things led by Aaron Siri. But the point that I'm trying to make is that I give no colleague of mine the excuse that they failed to deliver a standard of care and provide you informed consent, because I don't really give a hoot that they chose not to look that information up. Let the chips fall as you may. And there are some attorneys that are going to pursue this. And I hope, unfortunately, and I'm a practicing physician, but this was wrong, and physicians were complicit in COVID mania tyranny because they did not honor their oath to first do no harm and to provide standard of care. So one of my children got it and wound up in the ER with a vaccine injury, because certain families have tendencies for vaccine injuries. And like I told you previously, I had a medical exemption, but I submitted a religious exemption. I'm a devout Eastern Orthodox Christian, and I would have never gotten it. And I did almost leave medicine. And so I am sorry that that happened to you and to millions of people. And I think that we are not going after our physician colleagues enough. This can't happen again. And regular physicians could have made a big difference in this if they would have followed their code of ethics. But they were afraid, and we're not supposed to be like that. We're the last line of defense to protect that patient. So on behalf of the debacle that is current medicine, I apologize for you not having informed consent.
Well, I feel like there are certainly some doctors who should have known better and probably did know better. In particular, I'm thinking about some doctors who are in the public eye, and I think that they're not always honest. But I do think that, like, your average doctor, I don't know, I see them as victims as well, because I really do think that so many of them are so clueless, and they don't even know how to go about looking into this, and they themselves have been propagandized, and they often just don't even know much about vaccinology or immunology, or, right? A lot of doctors don't.
No, they don't. And I get your point. And we didn't learn anything about vaccines other than the vaccine schedule in medical school. I just spent 10 years researching it. And, my case is a different case because I was vaccine injured. I had the benefit of knowing. And it is true that a lot of them didn't know. But I think that's a big problem with modern medicine, and a lot of doctors are employed physicians, not private physicians. But I have to tell you, a lot of them had suspicions that this was a problem, and they didn't speak out. And if they would have spoken out, it would have made my life, the world's life, and everybody's life a lot better. And you are being kind, but I don't think that they should be so off the hook to the extent by which they should not be complicit in this happening again. And the public health officials, are in their own vaccine ideological bubble, surrounded by other vaccine ideologues, just like the military industrial complex ideologues are surrounded in their bubble, just like the food industrial complex and the like. So you're, much more forgiving of these physicians, and I get it. But I think that they had bad feelings and didn't act on them. Although I do think that it is heartbreaking because most of them did take it and gave it to their family members, and some of them gave it to their children, and they now have vaccine injured children and family members. And that breaks my heart because I really don't think that anybody should have gotten this vaccine or biologic. And I publicly believe that all respiratory virus vaccinations and biologics need to pull off the market. There's been no evidence that it's improving the health and wellness of the population. But you're kinder than I am. And it's really sad that doctors couldn't have prevented this or decided not to. Yeah, I'm so sorry that this has happened to us. So I would assume that your faith in modern medicine has been hurt, because once you see the first lie, you see a lot of lies, and then you see this lie, and then you see the lies of the world, and then you see the lies of the military industrial complex, and then you see the lies that we are not a working, functional, constitutional republic and that we're captured. That's just the last few years. How has that experience been?
Well, it's been a wild ride. Like, someone asked me recently, like, if you could have, the version of you in 2016, heard how you were talking now, what would she say? And I would have been like, oh, she's crazy. She sounds crazy.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I never really had like a lot of trust in the medical system anyway, because like it was obvious to me fairly early on, like that our medical system just, doesn't get to root causes of issues. And they just give out pills that mask the issues, that mask the symptoms, that they often just, see the body as these like isolated systems. So it's not like I even had that much faith in the medical system in the first place. Plus, my mom was a nurse, and she would always tell me stories about how, like, oh, this stupid doctor, this, resident or whatever. So things like that. And she was always a little bit open to like alternative medicines and, things like that. And I always felt like, yeah, you never know, some of that might work, and it was always shocking to me that like a lot of doctors didn't know that much about nutrition, for example. Like I was always, big on like healthy nutrition, and a lot of doctors you'll see are like, whatever, they don't know anything about nutrition. So I was always a bit skeptical, but I never would have thought that, they would have this unsafe vaccine that they would give to the entire world. It was just too crazy. Right. And it really is crazy when I still think about it, So yeah, this journey has taken several years, first getting red pilled about the vaccines. Well, actually, my first red pill moment had to do with more social things. It happened during George Floyd, all the riots, and that was pretty crazy. So that was that was when I first realized like the media was like not being entirely truthful. And then, I got sort of red pilled about vaccines, and then after that, like more about these political things, and that's when like, I somehow got this place where I'm endorsing Trump when back in 2016, I never could have imagined it. So it's been a trip, to say the least.
Yeah, that's very interesting that it was some of the social issues. I personally, as a physician, do promote health and wellness and proper nutrition, advocate for food freedom, try to incorporate terrain-based medicine. I also have been treating vaccine-injured patients before COVID, even because I'm a musculoskeletal specialist. So I work with a local neurologist and a naturopath, including IVIGG for autoimmune things and the like, and try to incorporate, basic concepts of, health and nutrition and things like that. There are a whole bunch of us, but we kind of like quietly do our thing for the most part, other than some of the public figures. But your mom and I would have been friends because I would have been right there with us. And as a specialist, I have to deal with some of this shenanigans that goes on. But you just have to tell the patient the truth and remember that the only person that you work for is the patient sitting in the room in front of you. And I've been in the same area for 25 years. So I just want you to know that and I know you know this, but there are some of us that are trying to see that the path to health and wellness lies in the biochemical order and homeostasis in food and nutrition. And that's a big part of how I got better, plus a really brilliant doctor in Hopkins when I was pretty much close to dying after so many anaphylactic reactions. So I'm glad that you're awake. I wish I would have met you like a few years ago. It would have been nice to have you as a colleague, and I think it would have helped both of our journeys. But I'm glad that you're where you are. Just for the sake of disclosure, I'm a libertarian. Well, I'm a small L libertarian. I haven't decided who I'm voting for because I inherently think that both the Republicans and the Democrats are corrupt. I have a lot of friends that are coming out in the libertarian arena who are supporting Trump. And, I think that we'll just see how it goes, because I have some concerns as it relates to him being the godfather of Operation Warp Speed, keeping Fauci around, him doubling down on these concepts. And I think that if he would just come out and say, which is a sign of a good leader, that, it's not all his fault. HR 5546 is not all his fault. None of it's all his fault. But to say that we need separation in science and state, to say that he was misadvised, to admit now that it was all terrible, that the vaccine is not safe and effective and it's dangerous, and that to admit that it was unconstitutional, immoral, and unethical. I think that there's a lot of people in the medical freedom movement who are going to stay home. They're not going to vote for Kamala or Chase, but they're going to stay home because until he comes clean about that, he's very scary to a subset of people who particularly knew the truth about what was going on with COVID mania tyranny from the beginning, right? So I personally don't know who I'm voting for, but I don't know if you want to go to the clip about why corporate media talks about how dangerous disinformation is, or do you want to go to the first timestamp that we talked about, where it talks about the lifelong Democrats could endorse Trump? Do you want to do that one first and then go to the other clips?
Sure, whichever order. Yeah.
Okay, Chris, why don't you go to timestamp 127? This is in the beginning of her amazing video where she talks about how lifelong Democrats could endorse Trump. I put Chris to sleep, possibly. No, let's see. We'll just give him a minute. Chris, if you don't want to do that timestamp, we can do 3449, corporate media and dangerous disinformation.
Was Russian disinformation, but we now know that they were the ones spreading disinformation. Corporate media outlets often talk about how dangerous misinformation is, but this isn't because they care about misinformation. This is about the fact that more and more people have woken up to how dishonest the corporate media is, and how the corporate media is increasingly under threat by independent outlets, which is why they attack free speech platforms like Substack. And yes, misinformation can be dangerous, but societies have always had to deal with misinformation. It's a very human problem, and there's never been an easy solution. But the corporate media wants to tell you that they should be the trusted news source to tell you what's misinformation or not.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
False news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
This is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 Unfortunately, Democrats are all in on this campaign of fear-mongering about misinformation.
There's no guarantee to free speech on misinformation or hate speech.
But you guys attack us for not believing in democracy. The most sacred right under the United States democracy is the First Amendment. You yourself have said there's no First Amendment right to misinformation. Kamala Harris wants to use the power of government and big tech to silence people from speaking their minds. That is a threat to democracy that will long outlive this present political moment. I would like Democrats and Republicans to both reject censorship. Let's persuade one another. Let's argue about ideas, and then let's come together afterwards.
You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. That's the test. That's the Supreme Court test.
Tim, fire in a crowded theater. You guys wanted to kick people off of Facebook for saying that toddlers shouldn't wear masks.
Senator, the governor does have the floor.
Fire in a crowded theater. That is criticizing the policies of the government, which is the right of every American.
Waltz himself was actually spreading misinformation during the debate. Misinformation and hate speech are protected under the First Amendment. It's also a myth that crying fire in a crowded theater is some kind of exception to free speech. It's not. The expression comes from a non-binding claim in a Supreme Court decision from 1919, which was
I can't hear it.
Later overturned.
Oh, there we
Kamala
go.
Harris has also made some chilling statements related to free speech.
We will hold social media platforms accountable for the hate infiltrating their platforms because they have a responsibility to help fight against this threat to our democracy. And if you profit off of hate, if you act as a megaphone for misinformation or cyber warfare, if you don't police your platforms, we are going to hold you accountable as a community.
Of course, nobody likes misinformation or hate speech, but the First Amendment is there because allowing misinformation and hate speech is preferable to the much bigger threat of allowing some authority, like the government, to decide what speech is allowed. It used to be that only a minority of Democrats thought that the government should take steps to restrict free speech online. There's a graph showing how much that's changed. In 2018, only 40% of Democrats thought we should restrict false information online. In 2021, that shot up to 65%. Again, nobody likes false information spreading around, but to say that the government should be the one to restrict false information? Let's not forget that leaders in our government censored highly qualified experts during COVID and spread misinformation themselves.
You're not going to get COVID if you have these vaccinations.
Yeah. Our own government institutions, which exist to serve the people, they are being weaponized against us. Attorney General Garland charged his newly created domestic terrorism unit with targeting those who hold, quote, anti-authority views. That included parents who dared to protest at Board of Education meetings, concerned and standing up for the right for themselves to have a say in their children's education. A draft copy of the Department of Homeland Security Quadrennial Homeland Security Review outlined their intent to target, quote unquote, inaccurate information on a whole host of topics, to include the origins of COVID, vaccines, the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, and U.S. support to Ukraine. Their misinformation, disinformation, and malinformation team exists to, quote, counter all types of disinformation. Once again, they get to determine what this disinformation is. The cozy relationship between the White House officials, the Department of Homeland Security, the FBI, and big tech is now well documented and results in private companies not restricted by the First Amendment doing the dirty censorship work of those in government who are not legally allowed to do so themselves.
A government that has the capacity to silence its critics has a license for any atrocity. And we are, we're in a very frightening time now where we are seeing the normalization of censorship. The First Amendment protects speech, true speech, and it protects lies.
Right.
It protects good speech and it protects bad speech.
Right.
They didn't pass the First Amendment to protect speech that everybody likes. They passed it to protect the speech that's inconvenient, that's abhorrent.
Yes. So I wanted to ask you, as someone who comes from the quote unquote left, your journey to being such a free speech advocate. I mean, the left back in the day used to not be anti-free speech. Was it something that you always held to this importance that you talk about currently, or has it been like a slow transition for you, or how did you get here?
I didn't really think about it that much until I saw that it was threatened. I think in the past, I would have agreed that you shouldn't censor speech, even if it was abhorrent. I think I had heard about the ACLU defending the Nazis' right to rally. I think I had heard about that. And that made sense to me. But again, I just didn't think that much about free speech until I learned that, we were getting censored by the government. And that's when I felt like, okay, this is the most important thing.
Right, exactly. And it's so interesting because every time we talk about free speech, or every time I talk to other people about it, and I'm a libertarian, the reason why it's the First Amendment is just so important and obvious. And it is to protect the ability for people to voice their opinions, even if they are incorrect in their facts. But this also brings up a very important concept about the difference between opinions and facts and what we are allowed as Americans to say. And I don't know what happened to this upside down world where, because we have a difference of opinion, we are subsequently being propagandized to hate each other. So the divisive duopoly propaganda machine has fostered this concept that if you disagree with anybody, and there's a lot of propaganda that can demonstrate this, you subsequently have to hate them personally. The concept of agree to disagree has been thrown out the window for the most part, and it's incredibly hurtful to the human existence in this country and the world. And so I think that's something that we just inherently need to talk about is, sure, we have free speech, but also, and some libertarians are actually guilty of this. If you don't like what I'm saying or doing, okay, you can say something, but you don't have to hate me and I don't have to hate you. And I think that it's gone way out of control, and it's incredibly unhealthy. And I also have this agenda item. There is no such thing in my mind as different disinformation or misinformation. There's information, there's facts that are irrefutable, and there are people who have opinions. And even for physicians, we render a medical opinion. And when I go to depositions for workers' comp and auto cases as expert treating physicians, I render a medical opinion within a reasonable degree of medical certainty, for which I do not check with the CDC about, which of course is captured by the CDC Foundation, which is partially funded by big pharmaceutical industry, right? So modern medicine has been kind of caught up in this as well, that doctors don't feel as a general practitioner or a specialist to render their medical opinion. And the science is never settled. And that's why we have to have separation of science and state, just like separation of church and state. So there's so much tied into this free speech agenda, and listening to people having talking points on the left, which is wild, how far they've come from what the left originally was, which is this complete political realignment that you talk about.
Yeah. I've thought a lot about this, and I haven't really really figured out like why they are the way they are now, where they don't care about free speech, where they're all gung-ho about censoring misinformation and all these anti-vaxxers online. They're terrible. I think, okay, I do think that there have been times in history where you see censorship getting ratcheted up more than at other times. Like that Supreme Court case that I brought up, Schenck versus the US, that was actually a period when there were some people who were protesting a war and the government was trying to crack down on them, but they were just handing out flyers, So they were doing it then. And I feel like it comes and goes, right? When opportunities arise, when the government has, there's some war or some other agenda that some powerful people are trying to, get the public to get behind. So that comes and goes. But in my lifetime, I had always thought of the Democrats as, pro civil liberties and pro free speech, all these things. It's just gradually changed. And part of it is the propaganda. Part of it is also this strange science worship where they think that, okay, there's this consensus. And if you're not part of that consensus, or medical consensus too, science or medical consensus, then you're fringe, you're anti-vaxxer or whatever. What people don't realize is that the consensus is often wrong. Sometimes, even the Nobel Prize Committee will make mistakes, right? Like, they awarded the person who invented lobotomies, that hasn't aged well. So people,
Right.
yeah, they don't realize that like the quote unquote experts, they often make mistakes. Science is constantly evolving. And you just can't, something may seem like crazy right now, some kind of, biological or medical, what they're saying, it might sound crazy now, like, I don't know, that red light therapy could like help, healing tissue or something. Like, I'm sure a lot of people thought that was crazy, but now it's like, oh, we actually have studies on it now, right? So what we thought was crazy now actually, may be valid. So yeah, this obsession with this consensus, it's almost religious on the left, the scientific, those signs, those lawn signs where in this house we believe, and one of the things they say is like, we believe in science, or I forget what it is. It's that sign triggers me because I'm just like, you're treating science like a religion.
Yeah, and one of the terms used to describe that is scientism, and it's inherently tied to socialist and communist principles. And it is a means by which we try to manipulate civilians by the arms of government, and which goes back to the fact that we need separation of science and state, and we need to have scientific discourse and discussions, which goes back to the issue with censoring people like Jay Bhattacharya and the like, because they were talking about the scientific discourse and rendering opinions on things that were important, which goes back to where really COVID mania tyranny was failed central planning by a few central planning experts, and also the fact that the industry and our politicians are captured by the pharmaceutical industry. And so I don't know what percentage of these politicians are just ignorant of the fact that they are elected to uphold and defend the Constitution as part of their oath. And so a lot of them probably should be removed based on their behaviors and the laws that they're trying to pass that are unconstitutional, or that they're so incredibly influenced by the pharmaceutical industry that has so much money, particularly the vaccine and biologic makers, because the fact that they can't get sued. So I'm not sure where it is, but this scientism, the science is settled. The doctor who wanted them to prep to wash your hands when you delivered babies was considered a lunatic and a heretic, and was thoroughly discredited. So medicine has a problem where we are not allowing scientific discourse. And 9 out of 10 doctors recommend Camel cigarettes. Heroin was prescribed. The debacle that is hormone replacement therapy, the cholesterol lie. We can go on and on and on, and a lot of it has to do with the pharmaceuticalization of the healthcare sector and the removal of alternative, CAM, and true paths to health and wellness. So the whole system of healthcare, health and wellness needs to be fixed, but first we need to remove the regulatory capture and insert competitive forces. So the answer, just like with anything else, is more freedom and more competition, and to let doctors render their medical opinions. But it is very frightening that scientism is being used, and it is disgusting, the behavior of some of these public health officials. The idea that they didn't promote vitamin D, quercetin, that they demonized hydroxychloroquine and zinc and ivermectin, where there was thousands of studies showing that they were safe and effective. And it's just incredibly suspicious to me that you cannot get emergency use authorization for the vaccine biologic if you have a medication to treat. And there was a systematic demonization of off-label use when doctors use medications off-label all the time. Aspirin is off-label, for God's sakes. And the other absurdity of the pandemic is that they didn't test for natural immunity, and they vaccinated people who already had it, and you never vaccinate someone who has already had it. And the idea that you were injecting mRNA to make you a spike protein producing factory when you by Omicron were 37 mutations away from it, and not even discussing natural immunity and changing the definitions. I mean, it's just incredible capture of the healthcare sector, an incredible capture of our government. And so, like we kind of discussed, my issue with Trump is I don't want him to apologize. I just want him to speak truth. And that's a sign of a good leader, that he learned his lessons, and he is surrounding himself with a lot of people. And I'm just one person and one voter. But it really does bother me that the whole topic has been avoided. And we should also be pushing at him to discuss what happened during COVID mania tyranny, because that was a huge totalitarian push. The United States of America was locked down, and we, the people, allowed the government to control our day-to-day lives. And it's really still frightening to me that we, the people, allowed our government, which exists only by the people, for the people, to do this. So I get how you have come to where you are, and I'm really glad that you've been on this journey.
No, I mean, those things bother me about Trump as well, about Operation Warp Speed, the fact that he has not said that he made a mistake on it. I don't know if we're going to get that apology or acknowledgement. But the reason that I decided to vote for him was because he had people like Kennedy around him. I don't know if you got a chance to hear JD Vance recently on the Joe Rogan podcast. So that just came out today. I haven't finished the interview, but I did learn that they did talk a little bit about the COVID vaccines. Vance, I feel like, is also a little bit, he's open-minded about these things. I don't know what's going on with Trump, whether it's just his ego that doesn't allow him to really feel like he can't wrap his mind around the fact that it was just a huge mistake that might have caused all these lives, the lockdowns and the vaccines. I just don't know. But I think, like I said, it's about Kennedy for me, that I feel some representation there. Yeah.
No, I totally agree with you. And by all means, I understand that these issues, of course, bother you as well because of how you came to all these facts. One thing that I would like to point out is him not admitting that, of course, it's not all his fault, could cost him the election, because some of the medical freedom people might stay home. You know how this election is going. So I know that he's been pressed to talk about this by his advisors. But I don't know, where he is with it. But I didn't see the JD Vance thing, but I'll take a look at it, because that would be good to kind of see. And yeah, Kennedy is incredibly important and has been in this fight for a very long time and has taken a lot of hits for this, and he continues to push forth. And he's an incredibly honorable man, including him and Trump have a lot of things that they don't agree with. It was very brave and really patriotic of him to agree to be with Trump and also Tulsi. And, my new favorite is also Nicole Shanahan too. I just love her. And she speaks truth, and she has an incredible ability to perceive what's really going on and grow and process and speak the truth about what's really going on in our country. So we have another clip. It's 3721. It's about free speech. Chris, you want to pull that up, please? Or we can go to 127 if you have that one up. Either one. Oh, okay. We did that whole clip. Okay, we're going to go to the next one, which is 12327. And this is talking about a vote for Kamala.
The DNC and its corporate media minions clearly indicated that they preferred her when they installed her as the candidate. This machine is why the DNC would rather go with a weak candidate like Harris than someone like Bernie Sanders or RFK Jr., even though polls had shown that they had a better shot at beating Trump. The thing about Donald Trump is that, love him or hate him, he seems to have a mind of his own. If he were to get elected again, he would have this silly notion that he'll actually be running things. And that's why he's a threat to powerful interests. That's their main issue with him. And while he was pissing off many establishment elites, Trump did something historic. He took over the Republican Party from within. It's no longer the same party. Nothing makes this clearer than watching people cheer someone like Kennedy at one of Trump's rallies.
And Trump introduces him, and people go crazy for RFK. This guy's has made his whole life as an environmentalist. And now he's fighting Big Pharma the last 10, 15 years, which is why the media has turned him into a crazy. But of course, he's not crazy. He's on point with that. And Republicans are cheering that. Watch this. Now, Bobby made his bones as an environmental lawyer. They're cheering an environmentalist. That's what's happening at a Republican presidential campaign.
A few hours after the assassination attempt at Butler, I got a call from a safe food advocate named Kelly Means, who's been fighting for many years to try to end the corruption at CDC and FDA and USDA.
So he's talking about taking on the regulatory agencies and fighting big corporations. And they're cheering it at a Republican presidential rally. Let that sink in, how it has flipped and how immediately Donald Trump is miles to the left of Kamala Harris.
I think the modern Democratic Party is an existential threat to the Republic. And although I am a Democrat, I've been a Democrat my whole life, the party that I see in front of me today is literally the inverse of the party I signed up for. This is now the party of war. This is the party of racism. This is the party of censorship. I don't recognize this party. There is no conceivable scenario in which I would vote for Kamala Harris. Am I open to voting for Trump? I am. I'm especially open to it if he is partnered with Bobby Kennedy, because what that tells me is that my values, which are a much closer match for Bobby's, are represented in that administration. And that's really what I want. I want a coalition to redefine American politics because, frankly, we have a long-standing problem with corruption, which has now turned into something else with the modern Democratic Party.
Yeah. I hope and pray that Trump finds a way to get these people appointed, because he's going to get pushback from the Dems, particularly with Kennedy, and the pharmaceutical industry will try to buy off the Republicans.
Yeah.
And so there's going to be some problems there. I believe Trump when he said that when he got elected the first time that he really didn't have help getting people appointed, and rhinos were sent to him, and he didn't have anybody to help him vet. I do believe him. I'm sure myself and many others recall that he was supposed to appoint Kennedy to Vaccine Safety Commission in the last term that he was president, and reneged at the last minute, took a couple mil from one of the pharmaceutical companies for his inaugural event. And but it seems to me that if Kennedy can kind of get past that, and they can form a unity government, and they could help to restore our constitutional republic, then on a personal note, as someone in the liberty movement, I'm going to be hopeful and give them the grace to hopefully do that, because the other side is way scarier to me. And there's a lot of other things going on. So let's go to this timestamp 127. And then I want to talk to you about how you feel right now.
Doesn't want to play.
I see it spinning. It's okay. Chris will figure it out. It's funny. I keep trying to go to this timestamp. Well, oh, all right. Well, we'll chat a little bit. And Chris, you can just interrupt us when it decides to want to be played. Oh.
How could lifelong Democrats move to Trump? Here's the short answer. If you've been relying on corporate media for your news, like the New York Times or Washington Post or CNN or NBC, this shift will be completely puzzling. That's because they're failing to show you what's really going on. Just like in 2016, when the entire corporate media didn't predict that Trump would win the presidential election, they're missing a historic shift in the political parties happening now. This video will try to show you what the world looks like through the eyes of the people who are at the forefront of this realignment in the political parties. By the end, you can decide which side you fall on. The first thing you might have missed is just how much the media lies. Take what happened at the 2017 protests at Charlottesville. The media led people to believe that when Trump said there were fine people on both sides, he was saying that this included white nationalists and neo-Nazis. But if you actually listen to what Trump said in his press conference about the protest, it's clear that when he said there were fine people, he was talking about the people who were there to peacefully protest the removal of a statue.
And you had some very bad people in that group, but you also had people that were very fine people on both sides. You had people in that group, excuse me, I saw the same pictures as you did. You had people in that group that were there to protest the taking down of, to them, a very, very important statue and the renaming of a park from Robert E. Lee to another name. Well, no, George Washington was a slave owner. Was George Washington a slave owner? So will George Washington now lose his status? Are we going to take down, excuse me, are we going to take down statues to George Washington? How about Thomas Jefferson? What do you think of Thomas Jefferson? You like him? I do. Okay, good. Are we going to take down the statue? Because he was a major slave owner. Now, are we going to take down his statue? So you know what? It's fine. You're changing history. You're changing culture. And you had people, and I'm not talking about the neo-Nazis and the white nationalists, because they should be condemned totally. But you had many people in that group other than neo-Nazis and white nationalists, okay? And the press has treated them absolutely unfairly. Now, in the other group also, you had some fine people, but you also had troublemakers, and you see them come with the black outfits and with the helmets and with the baseball bats. You had a lot of bad people in the other group too.
Treated unfairly, sir. I'm sorry. I just didn't understand what you were saying. You were saying the press has treated white nationalists unfairly?
No,
I just didn't understand what you were saying.
No. There were people in that rally, and I looked the night before. If you look, there were people protesting very quietly the taking down
It's funny because I had never thought of Trump as a patient person, but I think it takes a certain amount of patience to, kind of constantly like have to explain yourself, and they will think like, "Oh, you mean the white nationalists?" Like, no, what did I just say?
That's why we were both laughing. But this is the question that I have, or we don't know the answer to the question. But that reporter, so Trump literally just said, right? The white nationalists should be condemned, but there were other people protesting the statue, made the point about slave owners. Are we going to erase history? Yada, yada, right? The whole point, which was actually, incredibly spelled out. That reporter then says, I don't know if everybody in the audience caught it, says, so are you saying that the white nationalists are fine people? So did she not listen to him, or is it deliberate? That's what I can't decide. I don't know the answer to the question because we both started cracking up because.
Yeah, I don't know.
Was she not listening, or is it deliberate because she's mandated by her captured corporate press to play that word game with him to get the clip? That's the lie.
I don't know. I just do not know.
So when did you first figure? When did you figure this lie? You said the George Floyd lie, which is we don't have time to do George Floyd because there's so much there. But this, when did you figure out that they were lying about?
This was much later, actually. So, by then I'd already seen how much the media lied about, the George Floyd and the COVID stuff. I was completely red pilled, okay, about the media at that point. But I just wasn't thinking that much about Trump either, because he was out of office, right? I just wasn't really thinking about it. Yeah, I can't really remember when it was, but once I did see this, I guess it was once people were talking about the 2024 election again, so maybe it was like last year or something, when they were talking about him running again. So it might've been then. Yeah.
Right. And subsequent to that talking point was used at the debates with Trump, saying Kamala and Biden both say that he said that white nationalists are fine people. Yeah. And then they go with it. Right. So it's so dangerous because, humans inherently, have become very one-liner, one-clickers. And we have so much information consumed into us, which is some of the dangers of the current social media technology arena. And it really does imprint on your brain. But for some reason, which I'm so grateful for, there's so many people like you who see it. And I had the honor and privilege of meeting Jay Bhattacharya at a Gene Epstein forum in New York City. Maybe a year or so ago, I asked him a question, and we follow each other on Twitter. And I went up to him. He's like, "Hey, you're Irene from Twitter." And I was like, "Right." And I got a few minutes to chat with him. And I said, COVID mania tyranny and what you are doing for this country is a blessing in disguise, because truth needed to be found out and it had to get this bad. And he's like, "I'm not ready to hear that, Irene." Something like that. I'm paraphrasing. And he's like, "I was just, happy-go-lucky in the ivory tower at Stanford." And, I said, a lot of kind things. He's one of my heroes.
Same here,
because for so many reasons. And I'm really grateful to have those few minutes with him. But I do believe that, and I don't mean to discount the vaccine injured, the suffering we all have had under a totalitarian push and all of this. But I do believe that COVID mania tyranny in the end is going to be this weird blessing in disguise for humanity and for this hopefully restored constitutional republic. It's the same way that I feel that I'm not upset anymore about being vaccine injured and sick for 8 years, because otherwise I wouldn't be who I am today. And so I think our tragedies in our lives get us to a certain space. So I would just wonder if you would like to just talk about anything else that you'd like to talk about, and maybe some closing remarks, and where you think we go from here, and how else I can help you get this video out, and how do people find you?
Well, I'll just respond to something you were just talking about, which is that this idea that COVID was a blessing in disguise. I think it did wake up a lot of people, because there was all this corruption before that wasn't that visible, but COVID made it really, really visible. That and the discrediting of mainstream media, which it can't happen fast enough, and it's happening, and that's something that excites me. The other thing I'll say is that I'm also just thinking about what happens after the election. Like that's the biggest thing. It's not enough for the person that I want to win. That person needs to be able to govern. And like I mentioned, it's really hard when half the country is still in a totally different world than the other half. And in my opinion, they're in a bubble, a corporate media bubble. So yeah, for me, I feel like the most important thing is to get these people out of their bubbles. That's the way I see it.
Right. And part of the reason why our society is socially, psychologically, and mentally sick is that we're physically sick by the poisons that are in our food system. And I think that contributes to our ability to have complex thought and abstract thinking, which means, just so everybody doesn't misunderstand me, I'm not saying that everybody's an idiot. I'm just saying that when we're biochemically sick, our thought processes and our brain function doesn't work properly, and we're not able to process things that are important about what's really going on in the world. So I think that if we can make America healthy again, we can make America great again, because we can make Americans great again, because we won't all be in brain fog from the poisons that we're being exposed to in multiple parts of the food system and the pharmaceuticalization of Americans.
Yeah.
So I think it's
not just the toxins, but all these people on antidepressants, it's just, who knows what that's doing to their brains over time. So many people are on pills now.
There's actually no study that's a hugely controversial subject, and but I encourage people to do their research on the long-term studies of these. But interestingly enough, there's a study a couple of years ago in Frontiers in Medicine, I believe, and it compares the incidence of anxiety disorders and other psychiatric conditions and psychological conditions in the vaccinated versus unvaccinated adolescent, which I can send to you. And I want to send you my other white paper. The back in the day, psychiatrists were supposed to rule out organic causes of psychiatric and psychological conditions, including external sources and the like. And psychiatrists and psychiatry has been hijacked, of course. And there's a lot of not well-trained people doing quote unquote psychiatry, and they don't do a thorough evaluation of the biochemical state, the toxic state, and even heavy metal exposures. And all of those things are not done for the overwhelming majority of patients that get a psychiatric diagnosis. And so modern psychiatry and modern medicine needs to fix itself. We're supposed to rule out organic causes of neurobehavioral and psychiatric conditions before we give them the diagnosis that it is idiopathic per se, and before we put them on medications. And that's not been happening for the last 50 years, which goes again back to nutrition, food freedom, and the biochemical order. And that wakes me up at night. Sad.
Yeah.
It's really sad. And again, we need a healthy physical and neurobehavioral population to have complex thought to process what's going on in the world and for us to be happy. So I would like to have you come back on after the election, because I think we're both worried about healing the divide, right?
Absolutely. Yes.
Because maybe a few weeks or a month or so after, because I hope that Trump can somehow pivot to say that he's the president of these United States, and we need to break this us versus them Republican narrative that once they get elected, and we need to work on local elections and change who's elected into the legislature and things like that, because all of that needs to be fixed. So it's exhausting to think about. But I hope that, people like you and a lot of our other Liberty colleagues can just talk to our friends and say, well, okay, we know you don't like these aspects of him, but, these are some good things that he's done recently to help Americans. And this is why it's good, right? I think we have to probably be even more outspoken after the election if he does secure the presidency. So that all of us who really have a lot of kindness in our hearts, including you and a lot of people, to really be there for people, to see that, maybe we could just find common ground.
Yeah. It definitely does not end, even if he wins. I expect there to be a lot of shenanigans, during his presidency, if he were to be president again. A lot of roadblocks and smears as well, trying to fight his agenda.
Yeah, I'm definitely worried because of how we're so divided on false pretenses and propaganda on both sides of it. The response to the election. So I think I'm pretty calm about a lot of this at this point, but I do have some worries. So I spend a lot of time praying for people to have restraint and realize it's not just the presidency. We have a Supreme Court, we have a legislature, we have state and local elected officials, right? And I hope it's going to be okay. But how can people find you and interact with you? Tell us about your Substack. Oh, he just put it up. That's great.
Oh, yes. There it is. Yep. So all my info is there. Yeah, I have the Substack. I'm on Twitter. And then the YouTube channel. That's all there. Yep.
That's great. I just really wanted to thank you, first of all, for doing the video. And also, we never met each other. I just asked her to come on and she was like, sure. And I'm just incredibly grateful that you came on to this new podcast. And I really enjoyed talking to you. And I'm super grateful. I just want to explain how we exit out of this. There's a gentleman called Ross who made the Silk Road, which was a Bitcoin-based website. And he wound up getting jailed, serving 2 life sentences plus more. And Free Ross, I don't know if you saw some of, when Trump was at the Libertarian Convention, and I have the honor of knowing Ross's mom recently. So there's a movement to free Ross, and Trump said at the Libertarian Convention that he was going to free him. And also he tweeted it once or twice, and Trump Jr. tweeted it. And Ross and a whole bunch of other people who are beacons of freedom and liberty, we're pushing for them to be pardoned or freed. There's Ian Freeman. There is Ross. There's the pardoning of Julian Assange, Edward Snowden, and Roger Ver. And we did an episode yesterday with Aaron Day on that. And so these are people that are beacons of monetary and economic freedom related to having money not tied to the state. So Jordan Page, who was the musical face of the Ron Paul Revolution, did a song called Free Ross. And it tells the whole story. And so Liberty Speaks ends with this until Ross is freed. And a lot of libertarians who don't agree with a lot of Trump policies are actually voting for Trump for this pardon, which he said that he would do on day one. So thank you again, Joomi. We're going to go to the Free Ross song, and I'll talk to you offline.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
On day one, I will commute the sentence of Ross Ulbricht to a sentence of time served.
Is there anywhere on earth where a man can still be free? Will he bear the weight alone, or will he have to bend the knee? Is there no one in this land who grows tired of the game, where the wicked gather stones and build up prisons in our name? There's a story that you've heard before. It's been told